Okay, friends, we are live. So welcome back. This will be our last session on this particular book. So
Before you start, I'd like to hear your definition of altruism and dualism.
okay. The question is, before I start, you'd like to hear my definition of altruism and dualism. And altruism is actually acting for others, toward others. And it's usually contrasted with egoism, where one acts solely for one's own self. So altruistic deeds are deeds done for the good of others. So egoistic deeds are deeds done for oneself. So if you look at that in the current political scene, don't think I have to say much more there. So, and
It's a deed is done for oneself. That's all.
egoism
Oh,
is where it's done for one's own self. Okay,
Altruism is for others.
yeah, for others.
so then
Altruistic evil,
evil.
yeah, is evil that's done, quote, for others for what they consider to be a good cause. So it's kind of in many respects, I'm not too enraptured with that label,
Altruism? No.
altruistic evil. Okay.
Right.
Because it's evil that they think is, quote, done for the good. It stems from the old idea that the end justifies the means, utilitarian ethics. Okay.
Is that the same as going to the dentist?
Probably.
Sit still, this is good for you.
Yeah. Sit still, this is good for you. Yeah.
I'm curious, can one do altruistic acts for one's ego?
Well, that's a good question, actually, because there's some people that argue that there are no, quote, entirely altruistic acts. And a good example of that, I think it was Abraham Lincoln that was traveling along with a friend of his one day. And they ran across a sow with their piglets, and one of the piglets was stuck in something, and Lincoln freed the piglet, and his friend said, well, that was very altruistic of you. And he said, no, he said, it really wasn't. He said, I couldn't have lived with that for the rest of the day. I had to free the pig so I wouldn't carry that around, you know, and so it really raises the question. And, you know, you run across this, and I'm sure Pete's experienced the same thing in ministry and calling on people. When I call on people, I often feel that I'm the one who's been blessed. Okay, even though I have called on them for the purpose of bringing them cheer and goodwill and what have you, when I leave there, I always feel uplifted for having so served. Well, it boils down then to what is the question of the motivation behind it, okay? And how pure is that motivation behind it? Yeah. So, and dualism is to go back to one of our earlier chapters, we talked about the fact monotheism in a sense gives rise to dualism, because if you believe that everything is created by one God and there's only one God, how do you account for evil? So and the old classical argument here from the ancient Greeks is, if God is all knowing, you know, omniscient, all powerful, omnipotent, okay, and all loving, beneficent, then God either doesn't know what's happening, God doesn't care what's happening, etc. Those three come into conflict, okay? And so how do we deal with that? And maybe a part of the problem is that we are hanging on to an ancient conception of Greeks and a Greek understanding of theology, which maybe isn't completely parallel or capable of being squared away with God. The way I personally try to account for that is that God has set up our universe with laws, both natural and moral laws. And if we violate those moral laws, then we invite the dire consequences. And not only that, but if you take issues of disease, etc., even though the universe is established on the basis of physical laws, what does the what's the effect of neutrons that are streaming through our body all the time, and what's that effect in terms of our cellular structure and makeup? So yes, that's necessary to have that happen as a part of the physical structure and complexity of the world, the created world, but it may in turn wreak some havoc in terms of, cellular structures. So
I'm still looking for the Webster's Dictionary
of dualism.
of dualism.
Dualism maintains that there are two, powerful and competing sources, and in terms of Zoroastrianism, they had Ahura Mazda was the one god, the god of light, and then I forget the name of the other god, but the god of darkness, and they were competing with each other in terms of who would have power. So basically, dualism holds that there are two basic substances or powerful sources in the universe, Monotheism or monism holds that there's only one. And then, of course, you get pluralism, which is that there are several, and sources in the universe. So other questions before we get underway?
What is the devil then?
Pardon?
What's the devil then?
The devil? Well, according to Christian theology, the devil is a fallen angel who took upon himself egoistic impulses and wants to compete with God.
But that's not part of the biblical Bible then? Our Bible? Is that part of our Bible then?
That's the interpretation that we render it. However, there is some question as to just how much of a physical being Satan is. Satan literally means the confuser, Diabolos, the one who throws the ball around, confuses us. It may well be, some theologians hold it, that Satan is not really a real entity so much as it is a collective spirit of evil. So,
That makes no sense.
yeah, and so. Want to add anything, Pete? He's thinking. Okay. All right. Well, chapter 14 continues the series on the open heart, and this chapter deals with our ability to let go of hate. And Sacks says, to be free, you have to let go of hate. He notes that Moses was not permitted to enter the promised land. When it comes to social transformation, even the greatest cannot live to see the fulfillment of their dreams. For each of us, there is a Jordan we will not cross, a reference to the Jordan River that we will not cross. Once we know this, one thing becomes important above all others: leave guidance to those who will follow you, for it is they who will continue the work. Be clear, be focused, be visionary. So it's those who are going to come after us that are going to continue the work. I think it was last Tuesday or a week ago, last Tuesday, that Jeffrey Rosen spoke at SDSU on the pursuit of happiness. And I ordered out his book after hearing him speak. And he draws that phrase from our Constitution, and he raises the question, what did that really mean in the minds of the framers? And he points out it's something far different from our current understanding, what we think of as happiness. That really it was the pursuit of the virtuous life which leads to well-being and state of well-being. And he points out in that book, and I highly recommend the book. I'm about 25% of the way through it, that we have lost sight of many of these ancient virtues, and we are no longer teaching these ancient virtues. And we gave up teaching them when we abandoned the classics in roughly 1920s, 1930s, and thereabout. And so we're no longer emphasizing these virtues that come through those classics to the detriment of our civilization. And consequently, we do tend to misunderstand certain things. And a good example of that is what's meant by the pursuit of happiness as it's written in the Constitution. So how do we regain that? And then I've mentioned before, in terms of that, we're seeing more and more of an emphasis right now to STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, as the emphasis of education. And that is a good emphasis, I would add. But I would also add it's not to be at the expense of a concentration on the arts, which truly represent and teach us what it is to be human, to be part of a human family, a human society. And so the more emphasis we place on STEM and the more we abandon the arts, the more we lose sight of what's truly important in terms of the human enterprise. So these are things that if we're going to transmit these, we need to train up people to transmit these values. Okay, to pass them on to the next generation raises a good question. How do we do that? He says Judaism is a religion of love. The book of Deuteronomy is how Moses did this. The book of Deuteronomy actually consists of 3 farewell speeches that Moses made. Says it's a book that gives the command that defines Judaism as religion of love. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. Deuteronomy 6:5. And love the stranger, for you yourselves were strangers in Egypt. Deuteronomy 10:19. He says this is the most important interhuman command. Add, love your neighbor as you love yourself in Leviticus 19:18. Abrahamic monotheism was the first moral system to be based not on justice and reciprocity. Do for others what you would have them do for you, but on love. So he says, what is really unexpected is what Moses says about hate. Do not hate an Egyptian because you were a stranger in his land. This is a very counterintuitive command. So why did Moses say we are not to hate? And he answers that because to be free, you have to let go of hate. Hate imprisons us. So the consequences of enshrining hate, hanging on to it, religion leads to violence when it consecrates hate. That was the tragedy that befell the church in the 4th century. It took centuries for the violence to follow, but it was inevitable. Enshrine hate within a culture, and it will remain dormant, but still alive and potentially deadly. Christians did not kill only Jews, they killed Muslims, heretics, witches, sectarians, for the greater glory of God and in the name of the religion of love. Okay, which is a sad commentary. Then he also stresses you cannot create a free society on the basis of hate. If you would have people be free, it has to stem from love. So he says, letting go leads to liberty and freedom. What Moses taught his people was this: you must live with the past, but not in the past. Those who are held captive by anger against their former persecutors are captive still. Those who let their enemies define who they are have not yet achieved liberty. Never take freedom for granted, work for it, fight for it, stand up especially for minorities, and never give way to hate, even when others do. The example that I used when teaching this in my ethics courses, and this relates to this idea of the pursuit of happiness, the ancient Greek word for happiness was eudaimonia. It gets translated as happiness. It was so much more than what we understand to be happiness. Eudaimonia literally means good spirit. So how do we have a good spirit? Okay. And, according to Aristotle and the other classic authors, they said it comes about through the practice of the virtues. True happiness comes about through the practice of the virtues. And the example I used with my students is I doubt that many of us would think of Nelson Mandela sitting in his prison cell for 20-some years as being, quote, happy. But we would certainly think of him as being in eudaimonia, in good spirit. He had lived his life as a life of love, as a life of commitment to the good, a virtuous life. Okay, his life possessed great meaning, even though it might not have been, quote, what we would call happy. So that is the danger of losing sight of what some of these things actually meant. How did the Holocaust survivors exercise their pain? And this reminds me, by the way, of something that Richard Rohr constantly says, Richard Rohr being a Catholic theologian. And he says, if you do not transcend your pain, you will transmit it. Stop and think about that. If you do not transcend your pain, you will transmit it. He says, for decades, they did not speak about the past, even to their spouses, even to their children. They focused single-mindedly on the future, on creating a future. They learned the language and culture of their new home or homes. Only when they felt their future absolutely secure, 40 or 50 years on, did they allow themselves to turn back and remember the past. And maybe not so much remember, but begin to talk about, begin to process the past, okay? He says, that was what I learned from the survivors. First, you have to build the future. Only then can you revisit the past without being held captive by the past. You've replaced the past with something new, something better. Then he turns to the role of memory as a moral force. The Mosaic books refer time and again to the Exodus and the imperative of memory. You shall remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Yet never is this invoked as a reason for hatred, retaliation, or revenge. He said, don't subject them, slaves, to hard labor. Give them rest and freedom every seventh day. Release them every seventh year. Recognize them as like you, not ontologically inferior. Now, ontology is the study of being, okay? So you don't recognize them as being someone who is less than what you are, as being your inferior. He says, no one is born to be a slave. In Exodus and Deuteronomy, memory becomes a moral force, not a way of preserving hate by recalling what it feels like to be a victim. Remember, not to live in the past, but to prevent a repetition of the past. In the Sermon on the Mount, we are told to love our enemies, a supremely beautiful idea, but not an easy one. Moses offers us a more livable solution. Help your enemy. You don't have to love him, but you do have to assist him. That is the basis of the simple command in Exodus. If you see your enemy's donkey sagging under the burden, you shall not pass by. You shall surely release it with him. So this goes back to something I said a couple of weeks ago. In terms of my definition of love as acting for or on behalf of another in ways which are mutually fulfilling. You don't have to like someone to love them. And I think that's one of the great mistaken notions of our time. You don't truly have to like someone to love them. You can act for a person or on behalf of that person for their good, even if you don't like them. Okay, even if you don't like them. It says hostility may divide you, but something deeper connects you. The covenant of solidarity. If someone is in trouble, act. Do not stop to ask whether they are friend or foe. Then he carries this a step further. I call this who's on first, the case of conflict. The rabbis noted that in Deuteronomy 22:4, a similar law appears, but this time in relation to friend, not foe. It speaks of your brother's donkey. The Talmud rules that in a case of conflict where your brother and your enemy both need your help, you should first help your enemy in order to suppress the evil inclination. It's more important that you suppress the evil inclination within yourself. So you help your enemy first. Both may be equally in distress, but in the case of an enemy, there is more at stake. The challenge of overcoming estrangement, distance, and ill will. Therefore, it takes precedence. So, rather interesting concept. Release, physical and psychological. The ancient Aramaic translation from Targum Onkelos and the Targum Yonatan say something fascinating. They take the phrase, you shall surely release, to mean not just a physical burden, but also the psychological burden. They translate the verse as, you shall surely let go of the hate you have in your heart towards him. And that's saying something more than simply release. Okay, let go of the hate you have in your heart towards him. What is powerful about this provision is it is not utopian. Your enemy may still be your enemy until the end of days. People will still fight over land, wealth, and power, but strangers can still come to one another's assistance. And I think you see this in examples of international aid in terms of crises. We don't always help only those who are our allies. We reach out to people who are suffering, regardless of whether they are friends or enemies. Above all, he says, never seek revenge. There is an element to the Hebrew Bible that is often misunderstood. It speaks about God's revenge. The Psalms sometimes pray for it. Why so in a religion dedicated to love, forgiveness, and the future? Then he points to Yaroslav Volf, a noted theologian, exclusion and embrace. His thesis, shared by the Jewish scholar Henry Aplan, is that the belief that God will avenge wrongs spares human beings from having to do so. So, interestingly enough, this reminded me of Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant, by the way, decimated the old classical arguments for the existence of God. Just chops the logical legs out from under them. Okay, they all collapse on Kant's account. But he does come up with one argument for the existence of God. And he says, if we truly believe that there will be a reckoning, or misdeeds, then in the afterlife, there has to be a being which will reward and avenge. Now that, of course, is grounded in terms of one particular image and vision of God. As opposed to that, you have an image of God which holds to universalism, that ultimately all things out of God's immense love will be set right. All things, even those who have rejected God, will come to know and understand and accept God's love. And I've often said in that respect, I think from the standpoint of judgment, understood from the viewpoint of eternity, we judge ourselves. If indeed we die and we approach the throne of God, and we have lived an evil life, have hated God, we are going to approach that throne with abject fear. Okay. If on the contrary, we have loved God and our neighbor as ourself, we will approach God's throne with immense joy. So there's a sense, pardon?
Joy,
Joy.
joy.
There's a sense in which I think, we judge ourselves. And, but if we come into that, the immensity, into the presence of the immensity of God's love, how can we help but be overcome, affected, influenced by that love? So at that point in time, it may be a process of growth, development, but from the universalist perspective, one would have to argue that ultimately all things shall be made new. Now I'll share with you the first time I heard this idea roughly 13 years ago. I said, no way, that simply cannot be. Okay. That simply cannot be, because I was raised with a totally different image and understanding of God. So, my image has changed. Pete's going to say, get the steaks ready.
Okay, Larry, you're fired. Just for us to work with, to think through. If we are convinced that God is love, you have to be convinced that the love of God is capable of conquering the worst of hate. Otherwise, hate has to be stronger than love. Do you hear the logic? And it's a choice, it's a dogma choice. Either we're going to believe God is love, and if God is love, the creator of all is love, then for God to be God, God's power has to overwhelm hatred, has to render hatred powerless. The other alternative would be that hatred is bigger than God, and God is not the most powerful being in the universe. There's no way around it, really. I choose to believe God is love. I cannot believe that God has both love and hate within that creative being. I would concede, my particular corner says, like a good Catholic, I would hope for there to be a place called purgatory for some people to sit and consider their lives for a couple of aeons.
But this also goes back, and thanks, Pete, for sharing that, because that further elucidates what I was saying, but it also goes back to the quote that I gave you, I think it was last week, from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The dividing line between good and evil does not lie between countries, but it goes right through the middle of each one of us. And no matter how evil a person may be, may become even Adolf Hitler, okay, that there is still a bridgehead of good within that person. And there are instances, Stalin was another, horrible, horrible creature. But yet Stalin could treat a child with tenderness and love. There was still a kernel of goodness which was present. And it's that kernel, I believe, that can be built upon. So, continuing above all, never seek revenge. Not all injustice, let us alone perceived injustice, can be remedied by human beings. The attempt to do so creates more violence and more perceived injustice. And as I've said before, there's a sense in which some of us want to say, step aside, God, I'll handle this. Since you're not doing anything, I'll take care of it. Okay. That again is our egoistic impulses wanting to take over God's rightful position. So preserving the fundamental difference between God and non-God, the biblical tradition insists that there are things which only God may do. That is the meaning of vengeance is mine, says the Lord. We can never undo the past, nor can we fully remedy it. There is no perfect justice in history, only a rough approximation. The rest we must leave to God. As Maimonides notes, Jewish law forbids human beings from bearing a grudge or taking vengeance. To quote him, you shall blot any offenses against you out of your mind and not bear a grudge. For as long as one nurses a grievance and keeps it in mind, one may come to take vengeance. The Torah, therefore, emphatically warns us not to hear nor bear a grudge, so that the impression of the wrong should be completely obliterated and no longer remembered. This is the right principle. It alone makes civilized life and social interaction possible. It says this is the corollary of belief in divine justice. If vengeance belongs to God, it does not belong to us. Now, roughly 14, 15 years ago, I had a person who treated me with great injustice. Okay. And I thought that I had forgiven that person. I was driving down the highway one night and that individual came to mind and I just blurted out loud, you son of a bitch.
You're a priest.
Yeah, I know, I'm a priest. But I just blurted it out. And after that, I started to laugh. And I thought, well, you still got some work to do, don't you? You know? Because I thought, and now I'm to the place where I can truly wish nothing but good for that person. But it took me a while to come to that place. Okay, some of these things, they are real challenges in terms of our lives and bringing us to that place. But, and I hope, I hope that he looks back on the situation with renewed insight. It kind of brings me another thing that I'll point to here. Jesus' words on the cross. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. How do we understand that? Rick?
Well, it's interesting that he says, ask God to forgive them.
Yeah.
I think as a human being, I try to forgive people.
Yeah.
But as you say, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
So you sometimes say, God, I hope you can forgive them because I'm having a tough time.
Yeah. But those words of Jesus on the cross, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. I found those words very difficult to wrestle with for years and years, and it finally dawned on me. There's one sense in which I think we would all have to agree, they knew exactly what they were doing. From the concept of power, they were wielding power. They were following commands, etc. From the spiritual sense, They had no idea of what they were doing. And I think that's the sense that Jesus may well have had in mind. They had no idea. What we believe about God affects what we believe about ourselves. There's a connection, he said, between monotheism and letting go of hate. Different civilizations generate different character types. That is not because character is a matter of ethnicity. Ethnicity, that would be racism. And it is because, or it's also untrue. Humans are culture-producing animals, and the way we act, even the way we feel, depends in no small measure on structures of the mind that we have internalized from our environment and habits of the heart we learned as children. These religions are culture-shaping institutions, and they include not just a theology, but also an anthropology. What we believe about God affects what we believe about ourselves. Now, to take this a little bit further, and Sacks doesn't really go here, but cultural relativism, pretty big thing in our day and age, okay? We argue for cultural relativism and for the idea that truth is relative across one civilization, one culture to another culture. Well, there's a sense there where you say, well, yes, but. Yes, our culture, our background, everything that we bring, the way that we process any perception that comes to us is influenced by that. But to what degree? So I'm not a cultural relativist, nor am I a cultural absolutist. I think we live someplace in the middle, and we may move back and forth on that spectrum. May move back and forth on that spectrum. And even if you look at that from the standpoint of ethics, sometimes they'll give you the example of, well, what about the Eskimos that will abandon, and this was in earlier years, would abandon their elders on the ice. And very often, an elderly Eskimo person would simply leave their igloo and they would go out and sit down on the ice and freeze to death. From the standpoint of our culture, that's a horrendous thing, okay? But from the standpoint of the Eskimo culture, that was a sacrifice of love. If you are a nomadic people traveling for food, how do you care for someone? That individual person becomes a real burden and could threaten the very existence of the remaining members of the tribe. So the Eskimos saw that as acting out of love. So it's interesting. The absolute there was still love, but it gets played out in a different fashion, given the constraints. Then he brings us to the inner struggle. He says monotheism internalizes conflict, whereas myth externalizes it. The Hebrew Bible, indeed Judaism as a whole, is the story of an inner struggle. That rules out in advance and on principle the psychological alternative. It was someone else's fault. That is the real difference between monotheism and dualism. When bad things happen to an individual or group, one can either ask, who did this to me? Or given that this happened, what then shall I do? The first is a question the dualist asks. The second is a question the monotheist asks. Then he deals with blame cultures versus penitential cultures. In the blame culture, we're always looking for an external cause. So-and-so did this, that's why it happened. In the penitential culture, we're looking at an internal response. This is how I respond to what's happened. The blame culture focuses on the past. The penitential culture focuses on the future. The blame culture is passive. The penitential is active. And he says a penitential culture is constructed on the logic of responsibility. If bad things happen to us, it is up to us to put them right. When that is a culture's response to tragedy, a profound dignity is born. Concerning this profound dignity, it lies in the prophetic voice. Penitential culture says, God, I blame no one but myself. Forgive me. Accept my broken heart, then give me the strength to change. His peculiar power is that penitence defies entropy, the law that all systems lose energy over time. Penitence conserves energy by turning all suffering into an impetus to do better in the future. It spares its adherents the expense of spirit and a waste of shame.
Larry?
Yes, Pete. I know if I waited long enough.
So by way of illustration, my own country is sports crazy. We live and die by the games week by week. And one of the games that we just are passionate about is a game called cricket. And we had a national cricket captain who was a Christian example. The country loved him, admired him. He would often talk about his faith, cited as an example for all the children. And we played a series against Australia. And halfway through the series, it was discovered that this national hero had taken money to throw the match. It was inconceivable. You know, when you hear something and you cannot believe that this person, the captain of the team, and so what he was doing was encouraging the junior players to play under their potential. Because sports betting out there are laying odds on the game, and they lay odds on the game during the game on who's going to reach what. And the nation was in shock. So he comes back, recalled, fired as the captain, recalled. And his answer when asked, so why did you do it? His answer was, the devil made me do it. To go back, if you can just go back one slide, Larry. Blame culture versus penitential culture. The thing maybe we were hoping to hear from him is, I screwed up. I was tempted. I failed. But what he fell back on was, it's not really my fault because the devil made me do it. It's just, for me, the illustration of, you can blame someone else and not own it, or you're going to have to own it. I chose this and I did it. And sadly, he defaulted to blaming someone else for what he did.
That was, we had a comedian help me, people, that was
Wilson.
something we kind of, laughed at, remember? Oh, who was it?
Flip Wilson. Flip Wilson.
Yeah, there,
Flip Wilson.
Flip Wilson, yeah. And that was by word that everybody was, yeah, right, you know, it was a joke. Where did he pick that up? I mean, was he imitating Flip Wilson?
I think everybody at one time or another has pretty much said that.
But we say it in derision of ourselves.
Yeah.
We know it.
So what became of the player after he didn't take ownership of his mistake.
It became for him a really poisoned well. He lost his friends, he lost the national admiration, and tragically, he died in a plane accident a year or two later. And I think the thing that I grieve is, I don't think he ever lived to the point where he could move from blaming someone else to actually owning what he did.
Yep.
He was just bitter and angry. And I think, looking back, mostly bitter and angry that he'd been caught out. It was inconceivable that this national hero should do this. But I think we felt even more broken that he couldn't own it, that it was literally not really my fault.
So Pete, you mentioned, is it Gary Custom? What is his name?
No, Hansi Cronje.
Oh,
Hansi Cronje, yes.
Is it buddy of yours?
By the way, Flip Wilson used to also have a skit about the Church of What's Happening Now. And I remember one of his skits about that where he's up there and he's the typical black preacher and he's preaching away hammer and nail. And if this church is going to run, it's going to take money. And you know, he's going on about this. And finally, the elders are in the back of the church. And one of them says, "Let it walk, Rev, let it walk." So, yeah, all right.
I want to ask some questions about what you said at the beginning regarding enshrining hatred
Yeah,
or enshrining otherness. And there was that very disturbing 1 or 2 pages in here where it talked about something written in the Quran.
yeah,
But it's hard for me to believe that it actually was written in there that Jews are less than human.
Mhm.
I mean, surely that's not true.
Shafiq, do you want to
Yes.
respond to that?
Yes, this is a problem with people who have other faith, they take out of context. So this verse was said, if it is, what do you mean? I have to look at the verse exactly what it means. So sometime English translation is a very problematic, number one. Number two, you have to see the context. You remember, I think you mentioned many times in your this conversation, context matters. So you're talking about particular issue. When the Jewish tribe was in Medina, they betrayed the treaty. So it was referred to that particular time and particular issue.
Yeah.
Not the entire Jewish population or Judaism. So you have to see the context here, and context matter. If you take what you call cherry pickup, right? You know, cherry pickup, the cherry. So you cut and paste, you use out of the one verses. In the Bible has a lot of verses.
Mhm.
Old Testament, New Testament, I think a lot of huge verses if you can take that, right?
Mhm.
So again, you have to see the context.
Yeah, right.
So that way, I already get the context, what happens actually. So when you say, I am an immigrant here in this country,
Mhm.
and I am doing something anti-state, what because government will do? Will prosecute me, right?
Mhm.
What's the law of the land? I have to follow, right?
Mhm.
So if I go against the state, against the treaty, against the covenant, against the law of the land, I will be prosecuted.
Mhm.
There is no mercy here,
Mhm.
because that's the way I should be.
Yeah.
So same way, if you do something and you break the treaty, so that's what actually this particular time and particular issue.
Yeah.
Not the entire population or entire faith.
Right. And by the way, the ancient treaties, and we might have already referenced this, but if you take the covenant with God and Abraham, okay, where a deep darkness fell, and the command was that Abraham was to prepare the sacrifices and split the animals in half and lay them out on both sides. So the implication being that whatever party breaks that treaty would be like these animals, would be ripped asunder. So this was the part of the cultural understanding of the time. Interestingly enough, the smoking fire pot symbolizing God's presence goes between the animals. But God never required Abraham to walk between the animals. A picture of Old Testament mercy. Okay. So, but that was the understanding of covenants, and and they had witnesses to those covenants. But if you break the terms and conditions of the covenant, and if you look carefully at Old Testament scriptures, as you're pointing out, Shafiq, you'll find numerous places where we demonize and classify other peoples as subhuman, okay, and they're to be annihilated. So, again, culture, understandings, products of the time, okay. Let's talk a little bit more about blame cultures. So dualism creates blame cultures. It says it wasn't us, it wasn't God, so it must be them. You don't have to be an evil person to think in such ways, but the result of such thinking is altruistic evil, and it begins when you see yourself, your nation, or your people as the victim of someone else's crime. They can then be killed without compunction. Murder becomes a moral act. Since not everyone understands this, you have constantly to educate the people to hate through radio, television, the press, the internet, social media, schools, and families.
Children are not born hating.
That's right. Watch children, okay, when they are very young, in a mixed racial context. They play, they get along wonderfully, okay? Judy and I sometimes we're driving down I-29 and we see a herd of cattle that's completely mixed, and she said, look how peaceful they are. It's too bad we can't learn something from them, okay? And unfortunately, we see a lot of this taking place today in terms of educating people to hate. So the dangers of dualism is always potentially genocidal. And to avoid ever having to admit this, you must ceaselessly accuse your enemies of genocide. Blame cultures perpetuate every condition against which they are a protest. Isn't that interesting? We perpetuate the very things that we protest. Dualism is a cultural phenomenon devised by tyrants to manipulate people into becoming means, not ends. If you can teach a population to hate, you can get them to do whatever it is you want. And they will not turn against you because all their anger is turned outward. So what we do is we create the scapegoat, somebody for them to hate. It's all those immigrants, those rapists and murderers coming in from Mexico. It's all their fault. He says, build the future, redeem the past. Hate and the blame culture go hand in hand. Victims do need our support, but they need our support to recover the power of agency. Taking responsibility for your own fate is not a luxury of the moral life, but a necessity. First, build the future. That is how you redeem the past. And that ends that presentation. Any further comments or questions before we move on to the next chapter, the final chapter? So.
Yes, I have a question, Larry. So first of all, when you mentioned God is love, it also, I think, mentioned as well. So why then there are a lot of destruction, death and destruction on the face of the earth we see? First World War, Second World War in a recent time, the atom bomb in Japan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and then many more I can go on. In recent time, in the last few decades, where in the Holy Land, or other lands, east, west. So why this death and destruction? If there is a love, God is love. So why God allows that the destruction of this innocent human being, children, elderly? They're innocent. They're not warrior. They're not fighting. Why they're being killed? Such a way, such a brutal way.
It's back to the problem of evil. Sometimes we raise the question, why doesn't God do something? And maybe God is saying, why don't you do something? That kind of leads us into some of these recommendations in the next chapter. You know, I've said several times here that we worship the gods of wealth, power, and prestige. We operate in their service. And the defense mechanisms of the wealthy, the powerful, and the prestigious are such that if you do not bow down and worship those gods, they will take action against you. We very often see it. What do we do with the prophets, regardless of what age they're in? We kill them, we stone them. We don't want their voices. We don't want their voices to be heard. The prophets are the enemies within. To put it into the vernacular, what's going on right now. They're the enemies within. And if I just get into power, we'll take care of them.
So even people of faith.
Yeah.
So they
People of
justify.
faith, yeah, people of
They
faith.
justify slavery in this country, they justify apartheid movement in South Africa, Peter's homeland.
Look at the number of people
Yes,
who profess the Christian faith within our own country
yes,
that truly don't understand the depth or the significance of many of the things that we're talking about. They have a very glib understanding of the scripture. And it's colored from a cultural context. So, anything to add, Pete?
So the first crusade, the Pope rallied all Christendom to go and retake the Holy Land for Christians, because clearly it needed to belong to the Vatican. So the first crusade sets off, and there's this ragtag mob led by Peter the Hermit, who rampage across Europe. They're nowhere near the Holy Land, and they decide that they need to get revenge on the Jews, because the Jews killed Jesus. And so that first crusade is this debacle of people rampaging across Europe, stealing whatever they could from every Jewish merchant that they could find. I raise the story saying it has always been with us, this conversation. You've got to identify them. You've got to say there's a reason for them not being good people and us being good people. And once we figured that out, because clearly we're the good people and they're not, then we are actually in God's service. We are doing God a favor by getting rid of them. Every generation wrestles with exactly the same thing. Let us be cautious of whoever we're labeling as them and our justifications for needing to take them out and believing we're doing God a favor.
Maybe I have as many of you know, I was a teenager during World War II, and I can vividly remember the pictures that they put up of Hirohito, or of a Japanese person, and the propaganda that you introduced me to when you went into the service. Okay, so life goes on, and the Japanese actually, in spite of all that we did with the atomic bomb. They really have set an example of forgiveness and moving on. Okay, so I'm pregnant, I'm having a baby, and there's somebody that there too. And the nurse says to me, well, you know, that had a baby. And some people in here would know who I'm talking about. And she thought, you know, that they just have no trouble at all having the baby. Well, I later found out that this person was actually I had an Irish father. So see, she really wasn't full-blood Japanese, but she was subjected to this. I've had other people say to me, you just can't trust them. So they never got over this initial propaganda that was put out during World War II in the 1940s. So it's interesting, this hangs on.
My grandfather, who fought in World War II, would never buy anything that was made in Japan.
Okay.
Said you can't trust them. The Japanese, you can't trust them. So weird to be in the US at the moment and hear people saying the Chinese, you can't trust them. They are evil personified. Just a transposition of name, but it's the same attitudes.
Could this be generalized as a generational curse?
Yeah, but
And how do you break it?
It might be one way of characterizing it. These things just get transmitted from generation to generation to generation. And it's, like I say, it all gets tied into the worship of these false idols.
Yeah.
That, and it's fascinating because look at the church itself. The church falls prey to the worship of wealth, power, and prestige. Okay. What about the televangelists that live in $100 million homes? Where do they really stand? Okay.
Front of the camera.
Pardon me. That's about it. And that's quote, the prestige aspect of it. Okay. But, yeah,
Larry,
yeah.
can I go back to the question of why God of love, why a God of love allows all these bad things to happen? Is it not because he's given us free will? And he's not an activist God controlling our lives.
Yep.
And so that's why we need to be using our free will to address these things.
Point well made. Yeah,
I agree.
it is indeed tied to our free will. But, again, I still like the idea though of God someday asking us, why didn't you do? Where were you? You know? And, so. Okay, chapter 15, the will to power and the will to life. I found it interesting in this chapter that Sacks doesn't really touch on Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, because this phrase, the will to power, is very much a part of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy. And Friedrich Nietzsche espoused a philosophy of nihilism. Everything ends in nothingness, okay, and despair. But so the will to power or the will to life. He says here we have a foreshadowing of Cain and Abel. The entire tragedy of religious history is foreshadowed in the drama of Cain and Abel. God accepted Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's. Why does God reject Cain's offering? Modern interpreters tend to read it as a story about the tension between shepherds, Abel, and farmers, Cain. They argue that Abel means herdsman, while Cain means metalsmith. These readings miss the clue the Bible itself gives, namely the Hebrew meaning of the brothers' names. Abel, in Hebrew, Hebel, is a word for breath, Jews, like the Greeks, spoke of the soul or the spiritual dimension of humankind in language drawn from the act of breathing. In Hebrew, words for soul such as nefesh, ruach, neshama are all types of breath. Havel means a shallow, fleeting, ephemeral breath. Ecclesiastes is a sustained meditation on mortality. It's one of my favorite books, by the way. Life is no more than a breath, and all the wealth and glory, even the greatest accumulate means or nothing, because all that separates us from non-existence is a mere breath. Breath in human mortality. Abel represents human mortality. A mortality that comes less from sin than from the fact that we are embodied souls in a physical world subject to deterioration and decay. All that separates us from the grave is the breath that God breathed into us. Then the Lord formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. That is all we are, Havel, mere breath. But it is God's breath. Life is holy. That is common ground in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Cain means to acquire, to possess, to own. The Bible says so explicitly. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have acquired, kaniti, a man with the help of the Lord. The significance of this is lost on most translators who read it as made, gotten, produced, created, given life to, and so on. He says these two miss the point. Kaniti, I have acquired, is one of those verbs that, like the narratives analyzed in this book, yield their meaning only in retrospect when we have gone through the entire Hebrew Bible and then return to read the text in light of all that follows. So again, here is the significance, the importance of context. How does the verse fit into this chapter? How does this chapter fit into this book? This book, and how do these books fit into the entire Bible? So what's the context? How's this word used not only here, but over here and over here and over here? Okay. Rousseau's commentary. Rousseau unintentionally provided the deepest commentary. He says, the first man who, having fenced in a piece of land, said, this is mine, and found people naive enough to believe him. That man was the true founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belongs to us all, and the earth itself to nobody. The biblical position, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Psalm 24:1. It does not belong to nobody. It belongs to God. That's also, by the way, the Native American view. Okay. Yet when we came here, we saw this abundance of land, and we decided that we were going to fence it off and make it ours. So, he says, we own nothing. The entire ethical legal principle on which the Hebrew Bible is based is that we own nothing. Everything belongs to God. We are mere trustees, guardians on this behalf. We possess, but we do not own. So Sacks argues Cain represents the opposite, power as ownership, ownership as power. The Hebrew word for Baal, the name of the chief Canaanite god, has the same range of meanings. The root means to own, to possess, to exercise power over something or someone. That for the Bible is ultimate idolatry. Rousseau was right. Violence begins in competition for scarce goods, of which the first is land. What sacrifice is acceptable to God? Cain represents the idea that what I owe gives me power. When I give some of what I own to God in the form of a sacrifice, I am doing so in order to receive in return some of his power. That is pagan sacrifice, a way of propitiating, cajoling, or bribing the gods. We'll sacrifice the virgin to the volcano. Okay, that kind of sacrifice God does not accept. The sacrifice he accepts, that of Abel, is one that comes from the humility of mortality. God, I am mere breath, but it is your breath I breathe, not mine. In Psalm 51, 16 to 17, we read, "For you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise." And that reminds me, I think, of the words we find in Amos. Away with your noisy gongs and all this celebration and sacrifices and everything. The sacrifice I desire is a clean heart, a broken spirit. This, as the Bible understands it, is the fundamental conflict within the human condition, the struggle between the will to power and the will to life. Murder in pursuit of power while invoking the name of God is sacrilege. Whoever does it, whoever the victim, whatever the faith. And I say here, note, this personal note, we have a figurative interpretation grounded in their names as opposed to a literal interpretation grounded in their gifts. As both gifts were material, Cain's gift, first fruits of the earth, and Abel's gift, the fat portions of the firstlings of the flock.
Say that
So,
again?
okay, we have a figurative interpretation here. When you look at the actual sacrifices that they made, Cain's gift was from the first fruits of the earth. Abel's gift was the fat portions of the firstling of the flock. So this really doesn't come through, this understanding, unless you understand the significance of the Hebrew behind the names in terms of the sacrifice. Another way of looking at this, Cain's gift, the first fruits of the earth, were basically from his possessions. He saw those as rightful belonging to him, and he wanted to gain something from God as a consequence of making that sacrifice. Abel, on the other hand, was a sacrifice of the firstling, the fat portions, the firstlings of the flock, which, in accordance with Deuteronomic law, belonged to God. They didn't belong to us. They belonged to God. It was something that God already owned, and it was being given back to God in a spirit of appreciation. To add a bit of further light to this, I've often said when teaching some of my courses, you came into this world with nothing. And there's only one thing in this world that you can take out with you. Some people would say, nothing. You can take nothing out of this world. I beg to differ. There's one thing in this world that you can take out with you, and that is love. It's the only thing you can take out with you. And Paul, in his great discourse on love, says, hope, faith, love, all these. What's the exact quotation of that verse? Slipping my mind.
Faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love.
Yeah, but the greatest of these is love. And I've used this in funerals before, you know. Our faith disappears. Upon death, our faith disappears. Why? Because we have made the transition. We are in the eternal, we are in God's presence. We no longer need faith. We have the certainty that we've always longed for. Hope disappears. It falls out. We no longer have to hope. Our hope has been realized. Love is all that remains. And I think I shared with you about my friend who said that, and he's fairly wealthy, he told a group of Russian students that when he died, he was going to take everything with him. And they greatly objected. There's no way you can do that. And he said, yes, there is. I'm going to take everything with me. And finally, he shared with them, he said, I'm converting it to kingdom capital. It's all being converted to love. And I'm going to take it with me. Something to think about.
So Larry, is it biblical interpretation that you can take only love, accept everything? You can take only love with
Yeah,
you?
but you could only take love.
It's biblical interpretation, or it's just your,
It's my
understanding. So is there any biblical verses, whether Old Testament or New Testament?
I would have a difficult time pointing to any particular verse.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm just wondering, yeah, I'm not aware of that.
yeah.
So obviously, in our faith, we believe that we will take action, not anything.
Mhm.
The way we carry our life, we lead our life on the face of the earth as a human being. When you are alive,
Yeah.
we take action. So action will be judged in the day of judgment.
Okay, but the action you take is an action grounded in love. right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
obviously, yes.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So. As I've shared sometimes with people, sometimes I'm glad I come to this with a real strong philosophical background. Because I tend to raise some questions that I think many theologians would simply dismiss and say, we're not going there. Okay, set up a boundary, and I don't have those blinders or boundaries set in terms of raising really tough philosophical questions. So that's one of the things that I enjoy about my background. It doesn't mean, by the way, that I have everything right. I won't make that claim. Okay.
You're basically a heretic.
Pardon?
You're basically.
Yeah, basically a heretic. Hopefully a holy heretic.
It doesn't have that much hair.
Oh my. The voice of your brother's blood. God does not sanctify the will to power. That is the way of Cain, not that of God. When religion turns men into murderers, God replies, the voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Question, what will happen if we do nothing directly to confront the ideology that has led in our time to barbarism and bloodshed? He says, within religion, the most extreme anti-modern or anti-Western movements will prevail. This is happening in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Today, the secular West has largely lost the values that used to be called the Judeo-Christian heritage. Instead, it has chosen to worship the idols of the self, the market, consumerism, individualism, autonomy, rights, and whatever works for you, while relinquishing the codes of loyalty, reverence, and respect that once preserved marriages, communities, and the subtle bonds that tie us to one another, moving us to work for the common good. The result of moral relativism, altruism, misdirected, can lead to evil. That has been the thesis of this book. That is why the West must recover its ideals. The moral relativism that prevails in the West today is no defense of freedom. In a world of relativism, what talks is power. So there will be no more terror, more bloodshed, or there will be more terror, more bloodshed, and more civil war in the Middle East and Africa. There will be further barbaric new crimes against humanity, broadcast courtesy of the internet. There will be rising tension in every European country. People will feel that their liberties are being threatened, but will have no clear idea of how to respond. Sacks' point. My point is that we still have not understood what anti-Semitism is and the role it plays in the legitimation of evil. It is the first warning sign of a culture in a state of cognitive collapse. It gives rise to that complex of psychological regressions that lead to evil on a monumental scale. Splitting, projection, remember we covered those in about chapter 2, 3, pathological dualism, dehumanization, demonization, a sense of victimhood, and the use of a scapegoat to evade moral responsibility. It allows a culture to blame others for its condition without ever coming to terms with it themselves. The anti-Semitism flooding through the Arab and Islamic world today is as widespread and virulent as it was in Europe between 1880 and 1945, and it is being disseminated worldwide through the internet. Anti-Semitism is only contingently related to Jews. The real targets of Christians in the age of the Crusades were the Muslims, not the Jews. The targets of Nazi Germany were the European nations that had defeated it in the First World War and humiliated it thereafter. The real targets of the Islamists are secular Islamic regimes and the West, especially those who defeated the Ottoman Empire in 1922 and divided up its spoils. Jews, however, played an essential function in the group psychology of these movements by fulfilling the role of the scapegoat. They could be blamed for everything bad that had happened to the group. So we have traditionally made the Jews the scapegoat. Disguised motives. If anti-Semitism is to succeed, it must always disguise its motives. It did so in the Middle Ages by accusing Jews of killing Christian children and spreading the plague. It did so in Nazi Germany in terms drawn from medicine, the cancer in the midst of the Aryan nation. Today, it does so by blaming Israel or the Jews in classic blood libel protocols of the elders of Zion style for controlling America, dominating Europe, manipulating the economy, owning the media, etc. We also see this in the statements that are being made about allowing bad blood to enter our country. In the West, anti-Semitism is usually disguised as anti-Zionism. The targets are Jewish, not Israeli. The reason is simple. A scapegoat must be someone you can kill without risk of reprisal. Israel can respond. Jews outside Israel cannot. Indeed, that is one compelling reason why Israel exists. Hate destroys the hater. Anti-Semitism is not criticism. It is the denial of Jews' collective right to exist. The significance of anti-Semitism is its effect not on Jews, but on anti-Semites. It allows them to see themselves as victims. It enables them to abdicate moral responsibility. Anti-Semitism is a sickness that destroys all who harbor it. Hate harms the hated, but it destroys the hater. There is no exception. So he says, where are we? Can the world be changed? The answer is yes. And the proof is one of the most uplifting stories in the religious history of humankind. The changed relationship between Jews and Christians after the Holocaust. Today, Jews, Christians, and Muslims must stand together in defense of humanity, the sanctity of life, religious freedom, and the honor of God himself. The real clash of the 21st century will not be between civilizations or religions, but within them. It will be between those who accept and those who reject the separation of religion and power. And look at what's going on right now in terms of our own country and the separation of religion and power. The film that we showed last week, Bad Faith. Okay. Where are we? Those who believe political problems have religious solutions are deluding themselves as well as failing to understand who Abraham was and what he represented. The confusion of religion and politics was what Abraham and his heirs opposed, not what they endorsed. So what then must we do? He says 5 things. We must put the same long-term planning into strengthening religious freedom as was put into the spread of religious extremism. Secondly, we must train a generation of religious leaders and educators who embrace the world in its diversity and sacred text in their maximal generosity. Third, there must be an international campaign against the teaching and preaching of hate. Fourth, we must put the same long-term planning into strengthening religious freedom as was put into the spread of religious extremism. We must train a generation of religious leaders and educators who embrace the world in its diversity and sacred text in their maximal generosity. There must be an international campaign against the teaching and preaching of hate. And sixth, we need also to insist on the simplest moral principle of all, the first to be confirmed by computer simulation, the principle of reciprocal altruism, otherwise known as tit for tat. This says, as you behave to others, so will others behave to you. If you seek respect, you must give respect. If you ask for tolerance, you must demonstrate tolerance. If you wish not to be offended, then you must make sure you do not offend. Then he turns to a few words on the Genesis text. He says, the truth that shines through the Genesis text is that we are each blessed by God, each precious in his sight, each with our role in his story, each with his song and the music of humankind. To be a child of Abraham is to learn to respect the other children of Abraham, even if their way is not ours, their covenant not ours, their understanding of God different from ours. We know that we are loved. That must be enough. To insist that being loved entails that others be unloved is to fail to understand love itself. Our common humanity precedes our religious differences, as shown in the Noahic and the Abrahamic covenants. The image of God. He says, no soul was ever saved by hate. No truth was ever proved by violence. No redemption was ever brought by holy war. No religion won the admiration of the world by its capacity to inflict suffering on its enemies. Despite the fact that these things have been endorsed in their time by sincere religious believers, they are a travesty of faith, and until we learn this, religion will remain one of the great threats to the peace of the world. The crimes of religion have one thing in common. They involve making God in our image instead of letting God make us in God's image. And that, I think, is a very powerful statement. They involve making God in our image instead of letting God make us in God's image. And that brings me back to what I've said different times about, I think, the tremendous failure on the part of Christianity to properly understand the image of God. I think we see it throughout Christianity. And it's one of the things I find myself challenged with. How do I better communicate that? You know, so questions, comments. Technically, we've run out of time. We're on overtime right now, but yeah.
So as I'm rapidly reading this, last two chapters this afternoon, I'm struck with the fact that it seems like it's almost written contemporaneously.
Yeah.
And then I look at the copyright and it's 2015, which means it's probably written 2014, 2013.
Yeah.
So I just find it so fascinating that it's just seems so contemporaneous. But I'm struck by the fact that while he proposes solutions such as teaching better moral values, I don't think putting Bibles in all the schools in Oklahoma is the solution.
Right.
But I'm also struck by the fact that what do we do as a society, as a group of individuals are concerned about this? What do we do? The fact that I see that the amount of nuns, NONES, is increasing in our society, for those who have no affiliation with religion. I'm impressed by the group of people here in the church are trying to understand and learn, but we're a declining group. How do you address this as a society?
Yeah. I think I've mentioned before, I'm not disheartened by what's happening with the nuns. I think the church may be going through a process of purification. Maybe we are slowly coming to the place where we are beginning to realize what it truly means to be a Christian or a Muslim. Okay, this cuts across, I think, all the world religions. And you know, here recently, the Pope has made the edict the statement that all of the world's religions lead to God. They need to be recognized as such. That's a step toward reconciliation, a step in the right direction, you know. It's something I find myself wrestling with. And when I was preparing this, I meant to bring this book with me today and read something that was written roughly, I think, in about 1976, such a matter, almost 50 years ago, in Alistair McIntyre's book, After Virtue. And he's examining Aristotle's concepts of virtue and somewhat updating them for a modern time, but at the close of the book, he says the modern day is very much akin to what it was in ancient Rome, just before the fall of Rome. He said the barbarians were on the border. They were waiting to enter Rome. And to paraphrase what he says, the barbarians are not on our border. They're already within, and they have been governing us for some time. That's the truly scary thing. You know, they've been governing us for some time. And again, why? Because these idols that we worship, wealth, power, and prestige. Like you say, a Bible in the school is not going to solve this problem, especially when you set it up so that there's only two Bibles that qualify for consideration, one which costs $90 and the other is the $60 Trump version. Okay, and that's not going to solve it. But what about getting back to, in a sense, a more traditional educational approach that considers such works as this and Cicero and Aristotle and these great virtues across time, the wisdom of the ages that I think we have in large part lost sight of.
If I may respond to that, I might suggest that having served on a school board for a dozen years, that when you begin to bring in such things as social emotional learning, which is a potentially values-based system, you get objection from parents because they believe that you're teaching moral values to their kids. And they are the ones who should be doing that. While at the same time, when I hear that we should be inducing prayer in the school, I say we have a way of teaching these values to our kids. That is, do you take your kids to church, to Sunday school? Do you, as an adult, do you participate in church? Do you teach a Sunday school? And of course, I hear crickets when I ask that.
Why you ask such difficult questions? I think it's only right that we should say thank you to Larry for walking us through the past couple of weeks.
Can I say something regarding that?
You better be nice to him.
Oh, listen, this is a tribute to the fact that if I had ever picked up this book and started reading it, I assure you, I would never have read the whole thing, except for the fact that I knew that on Sunday, Larry was going to take us through another 2 chapters, so I'd better read it. Thank you, Larry.
Welcome. My privilege.
It has been a joy having you. Been a joy you walking us through it. We recognize the work that Larry has put in to make it sensible for us. And perhaps the encouragement for all of us. We who have inherited Abraham as a common spiritual father, perhaps we should learn to love our cousins. I'm just appalled by how often we denigrate the other children of Abraham, as if we are the only true members of Abraham's family. Let's become a little kinder and a little more welcoming of the family of Abraham. That even someone like Larry can be a descendant of Abraham. Larry, thank you.
You're welcome.
Final word.
It's been a pleasure to walk, through this book with you, and maybe at some point in the future, we'll be able to pick another one and do something similar if you're interested. I enjoy this. I see it as part of my ongoing teaching ministry in a sense. And as I read The Pursuit of Happiness, I find myself wondering, is it time that we resurrect Plato's Academy, for instance? And what would happen if we really put together a rigorous program in terms of the study of some of these classics and combine it with the best wisdom of Christianity? And it would be a curriculum that I think many Christians would be, loath to even engage on, because that's certainly not their understanding of Christianity, but perhaps it's a much more true understanding of Christianity. So these are some of the things I just personally find myself wrestling with on a daily basis. So, yeah, where do we go from here? The question. Thank you. With that, signing off.